Hey guys, and welcome back to the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop. I am Ray Russell, and this week, guys, we continue on our journey back to the early 1980s in Georgia Championship Wrestling, and here to talk about his time and even prior to his time there, as we're going to talk about Ole Anderson, the businessman, this week, and maybe a little Jim Barnett. Oh, my boy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the show the man himself, Bob Roop.
Thank you, Ray. Hello to you again, and hello to all our friends out there taking this in. Somebody might be listening to this, say, 50 years from the time we're making it.
Wow.
Like 50 years from today. But whatever time you're listening to it, whether it be immediately or sometime in the future, thank you for being here. We're glad to be back with you. And basically, because we're talking about Ray's history of how things are going as it applies to my career. We're both contributing, but it is my career we're talking about, basically. So Ray's doing me a big favor by letting me do that. So I also want to thank you all for letting me share it with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And this week, we do typically share your memories and your time in the business. But this week, we're actually going to talk a lot about what was going on in Georgia right before you arrived here. There was a lot going on in Ole Anderson's world as one of the promoters of Georgia, specifically in 1981, 1982. Jim Barnett, also one of the promoters there at the time. And hopefully we have time to get into the Barnett portion of the story this week. I think we're at least going to set the stage for what's to come because for those who don't know, Ole Anderson basically going to push Barnett out in regards to at least the finances. Barnett at this point is being able to put his hands on the money, and there's some things that come into question. We'll get into that later on. And Barnett basically forced out as far as he's still a partner because he still has stock in the territory, but he no longer is going to have a stake in actually handling the expenses, the finances, if you will. But before we get into all of that, I wanted to set the stage by trying to give you guys an idea into the mind of Ole Anderson and how Georgia Championship Wrestling expanded there in the early 1980s. Now, Bob, we were talking off air, and of course you had been in Florida and Amarillo and all over the world, Australia, Japan, Mid-South, and everywhere in between, Knoxville, of course, San Francisco. Everything's popping into my head now. But one place you hadn't really worked outside of that really quick cup of coffee was Georgia. And now you arrive in Georgia, right. And by the time you get there at the beginning of 83, Ole's already running Ohio and Michigan and whatnot. But prior to that, Ole had just expanded into those states the year prior. Now, in the fall of 1980, Ole begins to run Columbus, Ohio. So he's putting his feet in the water there, kind of getting an idea of what he can do up there in the Columbus market, in Ohio in general, and Huntington, West Virginia. Now, he does just simply run those two towns throughout 1981, but at the beginning of 1982, that's when, boom, he begins to expand into all of Ohio and into Michigan and whatnot. And that's the story I want to share with you right here.
Man, I'm all ears. A lot of it is news to me, especially the timing of it. I mean, it was all new to me in 82 when I got there, but I didn't realize at all the history of when things happen. So I'm glad to be listening to that today too. I'll get an education here in my own history.
We were talking off air, and you said for all you knew, because you had been working everywhere else, you didn't realize that Ole hadn't been running Ohio for the last 5 years at this point. So you didn't realize how new it was at the time of your arrival.
Well, and the other ingredient for today's listener, and now maybe if you're an older listener like myself, or even, you can be 20 years younger than me and still be 60. So, but even if it's an older listener, you need to remember that at the time, there was no internet. CBS was the only national television. It wasn't cable everywhere, and there weren't cell phones. So you wonder, how could I be unaware of what was going on in Atlanta when I was working, say, just only a state or two away? Was because you just didn't know, unless you were going to get on the phone and call people and ask them what's going on there. And when you were in the wrestling territory, I said the fishbowl, you came up with a bubble, which is better, but you're in the bubble for that territory. You really don't have much time unless you're working out of there into other territories. You don't have the time to be looking at what's going on in other places. So no, all what we're going to get on today is all going to, also, that's why I said it's going to be news to me, Ray.
No, I totally get it. When you're working 7 days a week, more often than not, it's eat, sleep, wrestle, repeat, right? Maybe some time to have a few beers in between and drive up and down the road. But outside of that, you're certainly not stopping at the payphone to get the 411 as to what cities Ole Anderson's running down in Georgia. So it makes total sense to me why you wouldn't have an idea of what was going on here. And this is a fun part of his book. I encourage everybody to go out there and pick up Ole Anderson's book, because it's just a treasure trove of great stories, and it's all in Ole Anderson's words. So it makes it all the more fun to read, because you can imagine.
And let me add, and that's great advice, but let me add, you can get a copy of Ole's book from Scott Teal, Crowbar Press.
Right.
In wrestling terms, crowbar is someone who's really stiff, and actually wrestlers, like they think it's real, are called crowbars. And so he named his publishing empire. He's done a couple dozen books. The guy's really prolific, and he does great work. It's a great book. Scott Teal, Crowbar Press. You can go right on. You can do it on your phone right now if you want to. Go look it up. And you go over these
lots of great books there. Absolutely.
Yeah, lots of them. Yeah.
Well, we're going to go back, Bob. Actually, I'm going to go back a little bit further than what I had said. We're going to go back to Ole Anderson's return to Georgia. He had left and he'd been working for the Crockett's, and of course, making money hand over fist down there with Gene as his tag team partner. But he returns to Georgia in the summer of 1980. And there's a big storyline, a big angle evolves there where Ole is a babyface coming back, but he immediately turns on Dusty Rhodes inside the cage. In fact, it was called The Big Turn of 1980. It was huge when it happened in the summer. And Ole Anderson turns heel, and then they go and they make a ton of money there. But eventually, Ole, as we talked about, he's going to book for Crockett. And so they try out a bunch of different bookers here in Georgia throughout 1981. We're actually covering that on my regional wrestling. We just finished that up recently, the year of 81, and all the different bookers that came through there, from Robert Fuller to Buck Robley to George Scott. And Ole would eventually return by the end of the summer and take over the book in late 81. And he would hold the book all the way basically to the demise of Georgia. So that's how long he was booker here moving forward. But Ole goes back and he says, when I returned to Georgia in May of 1980, I really began to study the statistics that TBS published. The printouts listed every cable system and the number of homes that were hooked up to the service. We immediately noticed that many small towns had over 20,000 subscribers on their local cable system, and they all received TBS. We began to ask ourselves, why aren't we running these towns? Our focus shifted to the towns that had at least 10,000 television sets, the towns that other promoters had overlooked. We began running Ohio, Michigan, and West Virginia. These were states that were dormant because the Sheik had given up. Johnny Powers was long gone from Ohio. And so Ole Anderson says, why isn't anybody running these towns? Because they all have cable, they all have access, everybody is able to watch the programming. Why is nobody running there? So it seems like common sense, but that's a large area there, Bob, where nobody was running at that point in time.
Well, think about this, Ray. One of the differences is the Powers or whoever else was running it. They weren't running it out of TBS. They didn't have. Powers would have to get TV in every town he was going to run. Maybe there was some that overlapped. One station might cover more than just the city it's in, but the television expenses would be so much more telling that would eat up your revenue. Just paying to advertise yourself, because that's what wrestling is. You spend all your time advertising. Think about it, a 1 hour ad every week, 1 hour. Martha Stewart doesn't do that. 1 hour, 1 hour promo every week for and on that, people say in Flint, Michigan, if that's talked about on the show, when they do those interviews for Flint, Michigan, when the wrestlers or whoever the commentator, when they talk about it, well, the people of Flint, as far as they're concerned, the whole TV is aimed at them, because even though it goes all over the country, what they're hearing is they're going to see the card that's going to be coming, the wrestling lineup that's going to be coming to Flint. So by having that same TV and not having to pay every cost of running it in every city, Georgia Championship Wrestling had much less expense. If they didn't draw for a while, it wasn't going to kill them, because the TV costs weren't killing them. But if someone like Johnny Powers or anybody else, once their gates fell off, their expenses didn't change. So I could see how they wouldn't last forever unless they had a great run. They just had things going and kept it going, which I don't know the history, so I don't know. But
right. So, and that's an excellent point, because TBS, anybody who has access to cable automatically can watch Georgia Championship Wrestling. And for the cities that didn't have cable access at that point in time, then they could work with those specific cities, but they didn't have to pay every city in order to air their programming, which really helped them expand into various states. And another thing that all those states have in common, they're all connected. Michigan to Ohio to West Virginia. So it's very easy. As Ole says, we would book 5 or 6 towns and go up there for an entire week. We made a tour of it. We would fly up after TV on Saturday for an evening show and work every day through Friday. Then we would fly back and work in Georgia the following week. We would do a weekend, go home for a week, and then go back up for another week. That was our standard 2-week schedule. We ran Charleston and Huntington, West Virginia. We ran Saginaw, Grand Rapids, Muskegon, Michigan, Canton, and Toledo, Ohio. Those people were big-time TV wrestling fans. Once TBS was running in high gear, we cut out the Macon studio show. Now, Bob, you might not be aware of this. They didn't just run TBS in Atlanta. They also had other TV studio shows in Macon, and Fred Ward had one in Columbus. Now, Columbus would hang on at least into 1982. I'm not sure how long it would go on before Fred Ward, they would cut the plug on that. But Macon and Columbus had their own Georgia Championship Wrestling TV program on the weekend. And I believe they were aired live or live to tape anyway the same day. And so basically Ole begins cutting some of those out, because why waste our time putting on extra TV for one small city in Georgia when we can go make an entire week's worth of money up in the northern states?
Just an aside before we get completely away from it.
Yeah. I
have a vague memory of working for Fred Ward, a show for him somewhere. Just one time. Uh-huh. I remember it was an odd place. It wasn't, but I do remember it was different. It was weird. It was the only time I ever worked there. But if you'd asked me before you gave me that information about them having their own TVs, if you had asked me if they had TV, I would have probably thought no, they didn't. I didn't think they ever had their own TVs. But you're right, having Columbus, Georgia is a big town, so it's just good if you can have a local TV as well as TBS.
At this point, obviously, they're going to start running these other states up north. So Ole says we concentrated on our Atlanta TV only and bicycled it into West Virginia, Ohio, and Michigan. Later on, we picked up Baltimore and Altoona in Pennsylvania as well. At first, the only exposure we had was from cable. We ran the towns solely off the TBS shows. We didn't have one local station, and yet we were selling out and drawing a lot of money every time we ran up north. We would do $200,000 gross or more for the week. Columbus, Ohio was already doing more than $50,000. Remember, they started Columbus back in the fall of 1980, so he had been running there for a couple years at this point. Ole says, each night when we began going up north, Michigan, Ohio, West Virginia, Cleveland was doing the same amount as Columbus, perhaps even a little more. We went to Canton and drew 25,000. Cincinnati and Akron were each bringing in 20 to 30,000, give or take a few bucks. Saginaw, Michigan, 25,000. Charleston, West Virginia, 25 to 28. Huntington, West Virginia, 22 to 25. The towns were all doing well enough that the boys were making decent money. Do you remember all of those towns doing pretty well when you were there? And was it a fact? Did you feel that Cleveland was as big a draw as Columbus, maybe even sometimes a little bigger?
It was hard. The buildings were really different. I think Columbus, if I recall, was at a fairgrounds where there was the seats and everything were spread out. It was a different environment as opposed to Cleveland had an arena. Yeah. But I remember the arena being full. Specifically, one night the ring was late. It was matches were supposed to start at 8:30. It was 7:45, and the ring wasn't there yet. And so I remember looking out there and thinking we have to return the money on this show. Oh man, give back $50,000. Yeah, but again, they were packed in. If you were looking at the two, you might think Columbus was bigger. In fact, until you gave me those numbers, or gave me and our audience those numbers that they were the same, I didn't realize that. I know that Cleveland, I believe that building held 8,000 people. I seem to remember as being their capacity. Yeah, 8,000. That would average, if you to draw $50,000, you'd have to average ticket was say $650 I know there was ringside and general admission were different, but yeah, $6.5 a ticket with 8,000 people, that'd be about 50 grand. So yeah, that's very doable.
It's funny you mentioned ticket prices because that's the next part of his story here. He says, since we weren't promoting in expensive places like New York City, we were able to keep our ticket prices very affordable. I believe that we had to keep our ticket prices comparable to the movie prices. Makes sense. He said Bill Watts, on the other hand, the cowboy, was the kind of guy who said, let's charge $75. Now, I'm not knocking that to some degree because it worked for Bill. Bill was filling arenas that held 25 to 30,000 people, like the Superdome. And more, some of the fans were paying $100 a ticket. Who could argue with that? I never ran a town where 30,000 people came for anything, but Bill did, and he charged as much as $100 a ticket. Wow, that's a lot for back then. Somebody was successful at it, says Ole. He ran the Superdome and packed the building. Bill would do that a few times a year, just like Eddie Graham and Dusty would do it sometimes in Florida. But I was looking at going to those towns on a weekly basis. There's the key there. Not just every 6 months. Ole was trying to run these towns almost every week. He said, I just didn't feel there was any chance we could support a high-end ticket on a regular basis. I thought we could do it once in a while, but I looked at it over the long run and I asked myself, and this is where it gets good. Ole said he asked himself, do I want to draw $1 million over a year in the same building? Or do I want to draw $250,000 in that building for one show? That was the basis for my position. We were able to go back and continue to draw money consistently. So Ole was looking at the big picture, Bob.
Right. And Watts might have had an idea in his mind that maybe the history of the territory in Mid-South or what he had in his own personal plans. Mm-hmm. Maybe he saw what was going to be happening. I mean, Bill Watts a really smart guy.
Yes.
And he might have thought, well, I'm going to try to make as much money as I can here, as quickly as I can. Now, he didn't hot shot. He gave good solid stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
The matches are great. People got their money's worth. Otherwise, you couldn't sell at the Superdome $100 a ticket and not give them a great show, because if you did, you could never come back and draw there and do it twice. So, yeah, Watts was real good, and he could get away with doing that. But he wasn't looking at doing that for like 10 years, I don't think. It only might have been. I'm not sure. I mean, it might be in his book, and maybe you know it already, or we'll discover it. But and again, I agree with it. If Columbus did only say 40,000, but it's twice a month, right? Twice a month, every other week.
So every 3 weeks, I think Columbus was.
Was it? Okay, so it's about 17 shows. Even at 30,000, you're looking at close to 400 grand. So that beats
the 250 that Ole was hypothesizing Bill would make. So yeah, that makes total sense. So Ole was looking at the big picture, and I don't want to take away from Bill because we've talked about how intelligent both guys were as businessmen. In fact, I don't have an excerpt here in this, but I'm glad you brought that up because Ole admits, as he goes into the story that I did read, that it was Bill Watts that turned him on to looking into where the cable was playing well, like where people could see TBS. It was actually Bill Watts who came to Ole and said, you need to go figure out where people are watching TBS and start running there. So we go back to the Cowboy again, words of wisdom. He kind of gives Ole some advice, and Ole's smart enough to take the Cowboy's advice, but kind of parlay that into his vision as well at the same time.
I'm visualizing when you're telling these stories. I'm visualizing. Well, I never saw Watts and Ole together where I was there with just the two of them and they were talking. I was maybe observing or whatever. I was never in that situation, but I can see Ole, if the two of them were together, not that Ole would be trying to dominate. He wouldn't be sitting behind the desk and insisting Bill sit in front of him or looking, he wouldn't be doing all that posturing crap. But Ole just always, if they're in Atlanta, it's his office, so it's his building, his arena. So I can see him. He was always, it was very clear who was in charge. So if Watts came in there, I don't think Ole would in any way be competing with him, but it's just possible that Bill realized that, at least in Ole's mind, Ole was a superior person in that environment because it happened to be his home thing. Everything else about them being equal, because Ole was on his home turf, he was kind of predominant. He certainly would act like the boss. So, because I'm curious why Bill would give him advice.
I can't speak for the advice, but they were the same place at the same time because Bill was booking Georgia right around that period, right there in the summer into the fall of 1980 when Ole was there. In fact, Bill would wind up being Dusty's partner in the feud against Ole and Gene Anderson. So it was Dusty and Bill Watts against Ole and Gene. So they were in the same place at the same time, which really fits into what Ole's saying here, that it was around this time I started running Columbus because he looked into basically the Cowboys' advice. So why Bill gave him the advice, I don't know. I mean, I would like to think the promoters are trying to help each other, but then again, it's wrestling, and I should know better.
Well, see, that's the thing. I know Bill, and I mean, Bill knew I was intellectual and all that. He never talked to me about stuff like that. Uh-huh. I mean, not that we didn't talk about, just crap or anything. We didn't actually talk that much. But I just see, when I look at the two of them together, I just see him tell him that to Ole in a way to give him. And think about it. You give a guy advice and he takes it. Right. You have done something for him. It doesn't make you his boss or anything, but you're like the teacher and he's the student, and at least in that particular thing. Mm-hmm. It gives you a little bit of an edge, a feather in your cap or whatever. And I can see Bill doing that. And you know what? He might have done it because I know he respected Ole. He might have done it for that reason. And he wanted, if you respect somebody, you want them to respect you too. And maybe if you like them, maybe you want them to like you too. And by giving advice to somebody that makes them money, and especially with Ole, because that's what he was all about, was money. And you make him money, he's going to like you a lot. But whatever reason Bill had for giving that advice, it was sound. And Ole, I've learned these things because Ole was running this put together operation as far as I could see. I've been down there with Eddie Graham, and, great promoter, and places, and with Watts, great promoter. I'd been with those people already, and I was watching Ole in action, and we were going to these shows. And again, I didn't know that Ohio was relatively new. So when I went in there, it was still relatively new and it was fresh. So it was still drawing. It had that, we hadn't gotten into the law of diminishing returns or anything like that. And I thought that was the status quo, that it had been that way, say, for the last 10 years. So think about that. I mean, it gives you a completely different image of what kind of clout the company you're working for. If you think that you've had Ohio running and drawing, like you said, $200,000 weeks for the last 5 years, well, you're talking about a major league business, multi-millions of dollars, bigger than Jim Crockett almost. So it's not a surprise, but it's good to know that because my philosophy is that life is a learning experience. And I think even as old timers, as long as I want to keep learning and keep my brain working, I think it'll help keep me alive. So thank you for letting me inform me.
Even if we're only learning wrestling, it's still learning something, right? So, no. And Ole's going to give credit to Bill back here again in the story. He says, thanks to Bill Watts' vision of promoting through cable penetration, I began to notice so many towns that had high numbers of cable subscribers. We went to a small town in Athens, Ohio, and promoted their high school. Who wants to go and wrestle in a high school? Nobody. But we drew $13,000 at that little spot show. The gym was packed, standing room only. Cable penetration, guys. We went to a little town in West Virginia that was nestled in the hills. We drove in on twisting, winding roads. When we drove up to the town, it was deserted. There was nobody on the streets. I was seething. This town wasn't too far away from Huntington, but when we drove into the town and saw a sign that said population 2,000, you had to think it was going to be a major waste of time. The show was going to be held at an outdoor stadium. As we drove through the empty town to the stadium, I was thinking, my God, there won't be 10 people there. When we pulled into the parking lot, we found 6,000 people waiting to see Georgia Championship Wrestling. The town was deserted because everyone was at the show. Not only that, but everybody from 30 miles around was at the stadium to watch pro wrestling. The stadium was jammed to capacity. People made it an outing, says Ole. So imagine that you're driving through town. Nobody's out of their house. Oh my God, we're done. We're through. We're over with. As we pull into this little, I guess, kind of a podunk, West Virginia, backwater city is the way he's describing it here. And you realize, no, the entire town's out to see your wrestling show. And then some. They come from out of town. to make the event. So that had to be a pretty good feeling, but it's a fun story.
Yeah, it is. It is. I remember working in Akron, that little
Probably
show.
The Armory, I'm guessing.
I don't know. I do remember the name though.
Mm-hmm.
I do remember the town. Well, good. I don't think I remember the West Virginia one. I remember Charleston and Wheeling and Huntington.
Huntington was Ole's original West Virginia town. When he started running Columbus, I don't know if he did it immediately, but he would make it a double shot. Whenever they came up to Ohio to work Columbus, they started working Huntington as well on the same day. And that was throughout 1981 they would do that. That was before he expanded into the other cities.
You had mentioned earlier about us. I don't know if we talked in a prior show about we would fly into Columbus, Ohio, and if we were working just Columbus towns or Ohio towns, a lot of times the guys would stay in Columbus to get a motel room and bring in their clothes and whatever, and going to be coming back there. Sometimes if you worked in Ohio, you might work on the one side of Columbus, and the next day you're on the other side. You're working the town on the other side of Columbus, and so you would come back. You would drive to the one in the east side of the state, and come back to Columbus and spend the night, and then the next day you'd go the one on the west side. But if we worked in Michigan, normally you'd drive up to Michigan and stay up there because it was too long a drive to get all the way back to Columbus, Ohio.
Yeah.
And I think the West Virginia towns, some of them we drove. The ones that were closest to Ohio, we drove. But if we were doing a couple towns in West Virginia, normally we would stay overnight at least one night. So,
Makes sense.
Yeah.
We are going to talk a little bit more about Michigan and Ohio now. I grabbed some more excerpts from Ole in regards to how he took the towns, because remember, for the longest time, the Sheik owned the Detroit territory, and that basically stretched from the top of Michigan down into western into central Ohio. Now, Cleveland was considered part of the old Pedro Martinez, Johnny Powers territory. After they left, the Sheik started running shows in Cleveland as well. Vince McMahon Sr. owned everything from New York through Pennsylvania, all the way into the eastern side of Ohio, which was, they basically only ran Steubenville, Ohio, which is like an eastern city, which really isn't that big of a city. Youngstown is over there as well. I don't really see a lot of results in regards to Youngstown, but so basically Cleveland was right in the middle, and nobody really ran there after Johnny Powers. Sheik would come in and do some shows. The WWF at the time did not run any shows in Cleveland, to my knowledge, but for some reason, Vince Sr. had claims on Cleveland because it was part of Ohio. So that's just where we're at right here. I just want to set the stage as we begin to tell the story of how Ole took Michigan and Ohio.
Let me interrupt just for a second. It's mind-boggling to me that they wouldn't be running Cleveland. I mean, you're talking about a city of millions of people, right?
Yeah,
at least
a couple million.
I don't know. Yeah,
sure.
At least a couple. That you would not run in New York City or something like that. It's like, wow, you wouldn't run Cleveland. I was wondering, do you have any knowledge in your history booking? Did the Sheik kill Cleveland?
Johnny Powers killed Cleveland, essentially.
Powers did. Okay.
Basically,
okay.
What happened there, Sheik still ran here. It was a lot of the same talent because Detroit, Cleveland, I mean, they shared a lot of the same talent. They come down from Toronto. It was a lot of the same guys. So Pampero Firpo, obviously the Sheik, Bobo Brazil, blah, blah, blah. So lots of the same people anyway. But they say Johnny Powers killed the town. He hot-shotted and overbooked and everything and ran out of ideas and kind of left town because he owed some money to some people. And
well, geez, wow. That seems vaguely familiar to some practices in the wrestling business. With the Sheik, I don't think I ever saw one of the Sheik shows. Maybe way back, I might have watched it if he was running the TVs way back when I was a teenager, maybe. But I never went to a live one that I was aware of. But the Sheik himself, his shtick in the ring with the wild man, he never got a hold, I don't think, or had anybody get a hold on him. And there was always blood. He always had a knife or a letter opener or something.
Right.
He'd pull out of his, there was always blood. And you can only do that so long unless you're taking the rest of your card, you're having the opposite of that, at least on some of the matches, where you have because, you get people that, if all you're offering is that ultra-violence, there's people that don't want to come. They don't want to bring their kids.
Sure.
You don't want to bring.
You're alienating a specific part of your fan base, basically, right? I get you.
Yeah, and you'd eventually dry up and like what you said earlier. That's what Crip just brought that germ of an idea or a fact out of my head, was when you said the same guys over and over again coming back, and after a number of years, every guy's worked the other guy and done 2 or 3 different angles with them. And now here you're coming for the 4th go around. You're not going to get the response that you got from when you first started. And if you have basically the same fans, your diehard love wrestling under any aspect fans, if you got those, even when you start to wear them out and you haven't had something really exciting to come in to draw any new fans, well, that's where, because I keep wondering how the Sheik and Johnny Powers managed to kill those towns.
Right.
I just mind-boggling to me.
Those are the big cities, absolutely, and they've always been wrestling cities. I mean, even in later years, those are big towns for the WWE. They were big towns for Georgia, and Crockett taking over, or Turner or whatever, when they were still, I guess, running the cities and whatnot up in that way. They were still doing pretty well. Here's Ole's take on taking those states, taking those big towns. He says, "You name the town in Michigan: Saginaw, Grand Rapids, Muskegon. We were either selling out or doing very good business. Akron, Canton, Cincinnati, Dayton, we're all doing great business. I have no idea for the reason, but we struggled in Toledo." Ole struggled in Toledo. Apparently that was the only city, though. He says, "However, we could pick any week to go on tour, and we would draw a couple $100,000 every time we made that northern tour. The original Sheik was a little upset about us going into Ohio. The part of the country was always considered to be his territory, but he had quit running it. Which is true. The Sheik stopped running Ohio before he stopped running Michigan. Even so, I talked to the Sheik when we first began to promote up there. We didn't want to take anything away from him, so he was offered a deal and a partnership. But the Sheik didn't want anything to do with it, so we ran without him. He didn't really own anything anyway. He wasn't really running shows anymore, so why not?" Ole goes on to say, "It was also during that time that I called up Vince McMahon Sr. if he cared for us going into Cleveland. Vince Sr. told me, 'Cleveland is a dead town for wrestling. You can't make a dime in that town since Johnny Powers killed it.' So Ole asked, 'Do you mind if we go?' Vince Sr. replied, 'Yeah, why not?' Or he agreed, 'Go ahead if you want, but you'll never make a dime there because the town is dead.'" Uh-huh. "Well, I'm glad I didn't listen to Vince Sr., Ole said, because regardless of what he thought about Cleveland, we sold it out, and we continue to sell it out in the subsequent shows." So there you go. You asked why would people not run Detroit? Why would people not run Cleveland? Ole was smart enough to ask that same question over 40 years ago. Why are they not running these towns? He goes in and boom, immediately pops these towns, Bob.
Right. Well, I'm considering all these factors and trying to figure out why one variety or one brand would sell and another one wouldn't. I don't know if it's just out of Florida and Georgia or whatever, but I know that the matches in Florida especially, and also up into Georgia, because the Fullers and the Welchers also over into the other southern states over there with the Fullers and the Welchers, you had a lot of wrestling on your wrestling cards. You had guys that got hold. Now, I don't know exactly what I do remember when I watched TV. I didn't watch much TV, especially when I was wrestling. Why would you want to watch a television show where you just made one of your own, for example?
Sure.
I didn't even watch the ones I was on most of the time. Didn't have time. I didn't watch and see what kind of product that they were putting out. But I do know one thing. One of the reasons that Philadelphia was dead for so long was because the WWF did their TV taping there. And they would tape 6 shows. They would tape 6 shows on one day a week. They were, I don't know, maybe I think one day they would tape 6 shows.
Yeah, they would do 2 days of tapings, 3 shows on each one. Yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what they would do, they would have an audience there, and they would maybe kill a guy on one show, or have him carried out of there in a stretcher and bleed and all that. And then on the second match on the next show, here come that same guy back. He's half hour ago he was carried out of a stretcher. Here he comes back, got a little Band-Aid on his head, but you couldn't tell there was anything wrong with him. Well, basically, what I'm saying is by doing stuff like that, they exposed the business. So that when you went to Philadelphia to work, I mean, a lot of the people that came there, they knew that it was a work, but they didn't care. A lot of them came to hoot. You know, they liked
to cheer the heels. That was the heel town. Yeah.
Yeah. They came to, if you got the guys that really tried to impress them and make them think, well, my master's real. Oh, how would they do that? They would chop meat. You know, they would do the flare backhand slap or forearm smash, you know, on a guy's chest. And you could hear it anywhere in the building. But the people just basically just farted at that because they knew what they were doing. They say, well, no, you're not going to convince us this is real. If you guys were really mad at each other, we'd be seeing some blood, some teeth coming out, and maybe an eyeball hanging loose or something. But all you guys are doing is just messing around. So, it was really hard. I already told that story about me and Garvin, but what a terrible town, to Philadelphia and Baltimore. Well, two towns that are horrible to try to get the fans involved in what you were doing. Once I found out the history, I understood why. And now, if you had the same kind of thing that was going on in Philadelphia, if you had some touches of that in these other towns, I can see that where eventually they would turn a lot of fans off, and business would slump.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you know, we go back to these cities, these big cities, Detroit, Cleveland. Ole says, why is nobody running here? The Sheik, he tried to work a deal out. I don't want to piss the Sheik off. I know this is his territory. You want to work out some kind of deal because I'm coming up there. And Sheik says, I don't want any part of your deal. And Ole says, well, that's all right. I'm coming up there either way. It's your call. You know, you can make a few bucks or you could, you know, sit at home and be pissy about it, whatever. And so obviously that's what happens there. And I guess he felt Vince Sr. had claim on Cleveland, so he politely, Ole did the right thing for all intents and purposes. You know, the wrestling business, they own those invisible line, those territories. And he, just didn't want to rock any boats. I give him credit for that. He calls Vince, and Vince says, I don't run there. I mean, I own it, but I don't run there, pals. Or I'm doing Vince Jr., never mind. But he says, go ahead and do it. And Ole goes and takes the town, and we're off to the races. Now, something you may not know, Bob, and I only know because I lived it, Cleveland was one of the last bigger cities to get cable. It ran in all, it ran in all of the suburbs around Cleveland, but they started in the suburbs and wired it in towards the big city. And so we didn't get cable. I don't think it was even cleared or okayed by the city, the county, the whatever until 86. I think there was like some little rinky-dink cable that ran through that got like 10 stations, but until then we didn't have cable proper. And so there was no TBS here in Cleveland. However, it was on our local station, Channel 61, and you talked about how Johnny Powers would have had to go to every city and try to land a TV deal. And that's kind of what Ole did not have to do because he had TBS, but he had to do that in the cities where there wasn't a cable. And Cleveland was probably the biggest city without cable that Ole was trying to run. And so there's a story in here about how he acquired Cleveland and what he did to set everything up there. And I was going to read that next.
Let me interrupt just for a second while we're still on it. Mm-hmm. This is speculation. If Ole told me this, I don't recall it. But I think that what he did by going to the Sheik and to Vince Sr. and saying, hey, look, you had some this territory, you had access to it, whatever, and offering him a deal, by them turning him down, now think about it. He starts running it and starts doing good. All of a sudden, they go to come in.
Right.
Now, if he hadn't offered them in the beginning, he wouldn't have anything to say. But he went to him before he started running there.
There's no argument, even if they get pissy like that son of a bitch. They can't say that he didn't come to them first.
But what he can say if they go to they say he goes to Cleveland and he gets a building manager says, oh yeah, McMahon Sr. called me, they're renting the building next month or whatever. He could call him and say, hey, what are you doing? I came to you. You told me.
Town wouldn't draw a dime. Right.
Yeah, and now you're going to come in against me, Well, he would, in terms of the ball being in somebody's court, Ole would have at least a high moral ground on that one.
Right.
And also, being able to look the guy in the eye and say, hey, man, you don't want to have anything to do with it. But now that I've got the town that all you people up here killed, now I got running again. Now you want to come in and go against me.
Right.
Yeah, I think Ole was supremely intelligent about stuff like that. And I just see him. Now, it might be a variety of reasons that he did it, but I think that would be one of them, was to be able to say, if they decided later to come in against him, he could say, hey, guys, I offered you a choice. Anyway, I just wanted to offer that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It makes total sense. When I go back to what you were talking about in the TBS, the cable too now, and how that, it was basically running everywhere, but not everywhere. And it's not just Cleveland. There's other cities that don't have cable yet, or it's not widely out there with these cable channels, TBS, and all the other good stuff that was on back in that time period. And Ole's going to explain up here now in this next excerpt how they handled things in cities without cable. And he said, we landed a big TV deal in Cleveland, Ohio. Jim Barnett flew in and I picked him up at the airport. We were going to call on the station together. Jim made a deal for $500 a week, even though we weren't going to run the town for another 3 months. So I stepped in and I told the station manager, we can't afford to do $500 a week. This was the winter of 1982, and I knew I was already getting ready to kick Barnett out. So I told the TV station manager, here's the best we can do. I'll give you $500 every time we run a show at the local Cleveland arena. The station manager didn't hesitate. He took the deal. When we left, Barnett said, oh my goodness, you're so good, Ole, my boy. So Jim Barnett was just praising Ole and what he did. He able to save him some money. And Ole said, we eventually did that with all of our TV shows. If we were running syndicated, if we were paying $500, we tried to do it on every show, but it was based on the house. So as long as the house did well, they would give the local TV station managers $500, but only when they ran there. And Cleveland was like every other week. So he went from having to pay this guy $2,000 a month to $1,000 a month.
Right. Well, very smart business. I didn't know these details until just now. And it's smart business.
It's good business.
Think about it.
And it was also smart. It's kind of hidden in the story there, but he mentioned that they're not going to run the arena for 3 months. So basically Ole came in and he knew, we need 3 months of TV. We need to introduce the fans in Cleveland to this talent for 3 months before we try to run an arena. We can't have TV go on the air Saturday and then run the Cleveland arena Saturday night. We can't do that. We need to establish the stars and the storylines and everything in between. And so they built it up for 3 months on television, and off to the races they were. And they sold out more often than not early on.
Yeah. I remember it being a really vibrant town. It was a good, it seemed like to me the building, the venue was really conducive to wrestling. Cleveland was like a theater, and people, if they want to see something, I mean, there were matches around the world, some in India where 500,000 people would come out and stand in a field. They couldn't even see the wrestlers,
right?
But they would stand there, that was the wrestling match. There were no bleachers. There were no seats of any kind. People would just stand there, 500,000 of them at a time. So, yeah, well, that's very interesting, Ray. Please proceed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think back again to the comment about not going to draw a dime, and I think back to you saying, why would you not run Detroit? Why would you not run Cleveland or any of those towns of that stature? And I go back to, there's footage probably about 10 years prior to this, in the early 70s, of a match that took place in the Cleveland arena, the old arena. And it's jam-packed to the rafters, and it's Ox Baker versus Ernie Ladd. And Ladd's a babyface for whatever reason. And Johnny Powers, who had been Hulk Hogan, he was Americana, he was the babyface, he was the beginning and the end to the local Cleveland wrestling territory. As far as they knew, there was no other wrestling, and he was it. And he just turned heel like the week or two prior, and he comes out and he helps Ox Baker put down Ernie Ladd, and a riot ensues, and Johnny Powers hurdles a wall to get the hell out of Dodge right before they get a hold of him. I mean, it's right there on film. It's called the Cleveland Riot. The crowd goes absolutely nuts. And so I wonder, how did you take a city that was that riotous, that infectious towards the wrestling business and say 10 years, and maybe they did kill the crowd temporarily, but how do you feel that you can never make another dime there after you had people in that city that invested in the wrestling? You know what I mean? So it's good to see that Ole was able to bring it back up north here to Ohio, to Michigan.
Man, I don't know if Powers turned heel in a really disgusting way. I mean, there's sometimes you can do it in a way that when people believe in you, it'd be like if the Dalai Lama was having an audience with the Pope and he slapped him. It's just, you just don't expect it. And it's not heat, it's disgust and anger. And people say, well, hell with them, I'm not going back. They screwed us. I never thought Powers in a million years would ever turn heel. The other ingredient is that the kind of wrestling that they were having, we talked about it. We've talked about it a couple of times, at least I have. Poor guy, you have to listen. But the kind of wrestling they were offering, everybody that came in there, a lot of times their way of getting a town going was basically a semi-hot shot, where at least one or two of the matches, at least one, sometimes two, maybe more, there was blood, or there was somebody carried out, there was something, extraordinary, some kind of 3 or 4 guys beating the crap out of one, something. I had a picture in my mind. I told you the time when Dick the Bruiser was in the ring with Jerry Lawler, and it was a chain match, and Jerry took the chain, wrapped around his fist, and Dick the Bruiser had his back to him. And Lawler ran up and just smacked him in the back of the head with the chain. Bruiser didn't even register. I mean, he didn't blink. He didn't. You give him. He gave the impression he wasn't even touched.
Right.
And I heard the chain when it made a noise when it hit the back of his head. I mean, Jerry, it was a working punch. But the reason I'm telling that story again, it's very possible that was the style that they had, where guys like Bruiser and Crusher and some of those legends, those that worked in those places up there, was that they did a lot of meat chopping without a lot of selling, and there was very little wrestling, to where the point where eventually you kill it. It's so unbelievable. You hit a guy with a chain, he won't even blink.
How do you get sympathy on a guy? How do you tell a story? Yeah. I get it. Exactly. And there's always the time for, a guy to hulk up, as they call it later on, where you kind of no sell and you're coming, that second boost of energy, the adrenaline's pumping, and you're going to make the comeback. It works in that instance, but to just do it constantly, consistently throughout every match, I don't understand it either. It never worked for me. It's not my favorite kind of match either. I've been calling a lot of Abdullah matches from Japan recently, and depending on who he's working with, he can be very uncooperative. And so there's a lot of unfun matches to go back and watch and call with Abby, because he's simply not registering anything, and neither is the other guy, because if you're not going to sell for me, I'm not going to sell for you. And then it just becomes 5 minutes of bleeding.
Just the Hulk up thing where he's selling, he's hurt and all that. And then the guy's pounding on him 10, 12 times. Mm-hmm. And then this time he goes to pound on him, and Hulk doesn't sell it. Because now, like you said, the adrenaline's flowing and all that.
Right.
The point I'm trying to make is that the Hogan did sell it for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. Right. Mm-hmm. But these other guys, they didn't sell it the first time.
Yeah.
You're right. You never could get
Where do you go from there? Absolutely. Totally agree. Yeah. If it didn't hurt you the first time and it didn't hurt you the 8th time, then where do we go with this next exactly?
In fact, why should the guy be mad at you? Why should the British? Obviously, you didn't do a thing to him. Why would he be mad at you?
That's swatting a skeeter, man.
Yeah.
Hey everybody, Gene Jackson here, inviting you to check out the Retro Wrestling Review, where each week I'm joined by some great co-hosts who help me review classic episodes of USWA Championship Wrestling, and right now we are doing week-by-week reviews of 1993. But we don't just do reviews, sometimes we get a chance to interview some of the people who were there and lived it, plus do watch-alongs. It's a lot of fun, so check out new episodes that drop every Wednesday at WrestleCopia.com, and to find links to everything associated to the podcast, you can go to USWApodcast.com.
Hey guys, Ray Russell here, curator of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, inviting you guys to listen to many of the programs here as part of the WrestleCopia brand, including, but not limited to, the Wrestling Memory Grenade, currently covering the 1988 and the WWF project. You can also listen to the Regional Wrestling Podcast, where we talk the territories. You can also listen to the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop. But that's not all. You can also check out the Pro Wrestling Academy with the professor of Puroresu, Mr. Dan Gennity. Dan and I go back in time and cover the history of Japanese professional wrestling in the English language. And you can listen to all of those shows and more, all part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, located over at WrestleCopia.com. That's WrestleCopia.com, and anywhere your podcast streaming needs are met. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to our social media guys for all the latest goings on here at the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. Plus, I'm constantly adding old school video clips and pictures from throughout wrestling history. You can follow us over on X, formerly Twitter, at Wrestling Grenade. That's at RASSLIN Grenade. Also, follow and like me, Facebook.com/Wrestling Grenade. And why not subscribe to YouTube.com/Wrestling Grenade. And of course, now would be a fantastic time to become a WrestleCopia patron over at Patreon.com/WrestleCopia. That address again, Patreon.com/WrestleCopia, where you get so many gifts, including all of my insanely detailed show notes for every episode of The Grenade Show, Regional Wrestling, and the Monday Warfare podcast. You'll also get early access to a lot of the podcasts here on the WrestleCopia brand, where you can listen days and sometimes as much as a week earlier than the rest of the listeners. But that's still not all, guys. You also get at least a dozen digital downloads for your viewing and reading pleasure each and every month, plus random bonus video drops, and of course, the Patreon exclusive watch-along series covering many past WWF and WCW events. And if that's not all, videocasts, also now a part of Patreon. No subscription, cancel anytime. Give it a try for a month, guys. I think you'll like the content that I offer, and every penny of it goes right back here into paying the bills. So if you're looking to support that next up-and-coming podcast brand, please consider making it WrestleCopia. Help me pay some of the bills to keep the WrestleCopia Podcast Network and all of the great shows here up and running for the months and the years to come.
Hey, it's Bob Smith, and guess what? The Outdated Wrestling Hour is now part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. But hey, no fear, you're still going to hear the unique guests, comedy, music, authors, journalists, funny people. Who knows who's going to end up on the Outdated Wrestling Hour? Remember, it's all new and all old. So check it out in the WrestleCopia Podcast Network and wherever you get your podcasts. Listen if you know what's good for you.
I thought, I knew all of this took place before your time there, but I thought you would find it fascinating to some degree as to how everything got to where it was right before you got there. And that was part of it. There's some other fun little stories here. I don't know how much we're going to get into the Barnett story, so I do want to get into a little of that. But there was a line here that I saved. I just want to read it. Now, it really doesn't have anything to do with what we just discussed, but I do want to we talked about this a little bit in the past, so I wanted to mention this here at this point in the show, since we're kind of done with the business part for now. I titled this little headline, Overworked, because Ole said here, after he talked about adding all of these extra towns in Georgia, he said, Georgia, Charlotte and the Carolinas, booking Toronto, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, Michigan now. I was programming more than 150 wrestlers at one time, just listing everybody on the charts to be sure I didn't double book them. Double booking anybody in two different cities was a major chore. I was running myself ragged. And I think that's the only point in Ole's 9,000-page book. No, I don't know how many pages. It was a lot of great reading, though. But I think that's the only time in his entire book where he admits defeat. Like, that was my one mistake in my entire life, was trying to book 47 different towns at the same time.
Right. We talked about that briefly last week or the week before about when he was when he fired Paul Orndorff, was that he knew he could make somebody else. He's got 150 guys in his head, figuring out, how to make every one of them, put heat on the heels and how to put, sympathy on the baby faces. He's thinking of all that, and think of the mind power, the amount of creative thinking that goes into that. Mm-hmm. And now he's going to focus all that mentality and all that experience and all that talent on one person, as far as how to build a guy, say, in 2 or 3 weeks, instead of taking 10 weeks and doing it slower. Hot shot the guy in a way. Now, I don't mean the blood and guts, but, you do something, you bring week 2 or 3, you bring the guy's mother in or something and get her pile drive or whatever, to where you get the guy you get the guy over a lot quicker if that's what you have to have. You know,
right.
if you just absolutely have to have somebody. But yeah, to think that Ole never had any doubt in his mind that he said, the business is a work. A lot of different people can do it. Now, when you have Hulk Hogan, I mean, that is a commodity that once he was built, it represented a lot of problems potentially if you thought about him leaving you and tomorrow he's on somebody else's TV talking about running in the same town you're running. That's the problem.
Well, Vern found that out, when Vince took Hulk from Vern. Hulk went back there eventually and worked Milwaukee, worked St. Paul. Those were the towns he had been big, over there. They even convinced Mean Gene Okerlund to wrestle a tag match with Hulk Hogan back in 1984. And of course, Mean Gene had been the voice of the AWA, and he came over with Hulk. And so they got Mean Gene in the ring with Hulk. I think it was in Minnesota, of course, Vern country. And it was unbelievable that they went and did that. And I'm sure they did very well, pretty good business there, I'd have to think.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, that's a gimmick match, They're not expecting a lot of heroics from Mean Gene.
No, it was comedy, but it was fun. It was funny. It was good.
Well,
for what it was.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's a good booking, because you're having it is a gimmick, but it's a gimmick with a guy that everybody knows,
right?
And has some feeling for, some respect or affection or whatever,
right?
Loyalty from him, giving him, being part of a good wrestling program for a few years. That's a good booking. So I'm sure it drew.
Well, we're going to pretty shortly here, we're going to get into the Barnett story in regards to the shenanigans that may or may not have been going on behind the scenes. Keep your mind out of the gutter, guys. I'm talking about involving money here. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about money. And things like the State Athletic Commission and local fire marshals. And I can't see you, Bob, but I have to think maybe at least inside your head there's a little smile on your face because you know how these people operate. And from everything I've ever heard from anybody, I don't know anybody's ever had anything good to say about the State Athletic Commission, especially when it came to pro wrestling, unless you worked for the State Athletic Commission anyway. Right.
Yeah. Oh, well, the only time they affect you really is when they suspend your license. For the wrestler itself, it's not a big deal. You have to get a physical in a dressing room, and the doctor listens to your heart with a stethoscope and looks in your eyes and basically says you're okay. And it's not like any big. It doesn't take more than about 30 seconds. He's checked the guy, but it was for a promoter. Like the story. We talked about a story in Grand Rapids where Ole threatened to cancel the show because the guy wasn't going to let Ivan Koloff wrestle because he had been carried out the night before in another Michigan town across the state. The commission doctor wasn't going to let him wrestle, and Ole threatened to cancel the show, which meant that they were, they got 10% for doing nothing really.
Right.
They had an athletic commission. I think that if hopefully the athletic commission, where they could really do some good is protecting boxers. A lot of times there were terrible abuses in boxing where they get some poor guy who was, just not equipped to go against someone who was going to slaughter them. They didn't know they were going to get slaughtered, or they wouldn't have gone for it. But the doctors are there to prevent guys who are already hurt, maybe, or I told you about taking a physical to work in the garden, and there was a boxer was waiting to take the test or took it. I think he was taking it when I got there, and he was basically blind. He couldn't see the letters. He started 10, 12 feet away. He moved up to within 3 feet. He couldn't see hardly. He had to turn sideways to see it all, and he was looking out of the corner of his eyes. I mean, the guy was basically straight ahead. He was basically blind.
Wow.
And so I thought, well, he was supposed to be. They had a show the next night, a boxing show, big show, Madison Square Garden boxing. And I thought, well, he'll be canceled. I checked the paper a day or two later, and he was on the card. The commission can protect people.
They can, but in pro wrestling standards, it seems like more often than not, you hear tell of crooked State Athletic Commission. They're just looking for a couple of bucks in the pocket, and they would find simple little things wrong with the show in order to maybe grease the wheels, so to speak. I've heard stories in the past anyway of things like that. And Ole tells a couple of them here. You just mentioned one of them. I believe it was Grand Rapids there with the Ivan Koloff situation where they didn't want Ivan to work or whatever. I don't know if it was high blood pressure, whatever the deal was, but they didn't want Ivan to work. And Ole said, well, I'll go out there and announce that, we're going to cancel the entire show. But they're like, oh man, that's a lot of money we're going to lose. Well, okay. Well, guess what? Now he can compete. And so there's another story here that was in Saginaw, says Ole. The commission was paid a few bucks at each show. Imagine that. In one of these towns, the commission representative told me that we had to adjust the height of the ring because it was too low. I said, what does that have to do with anything? Asked Ole. Well, this is not a regulation-sized ring, he explained. It has to be so-and-so inches. Whatever the height was, in my opinion, he was just looking for a little bit of a payoff. I asked him for his name, address, and phone number. What do you want that for? Asked the commissioner. I summed it up for him. I'm going out to the ring to make the announcement that Commissioner Joe Smith ordered us to cancel the show because the ring is too low and everyone has to get their money back and go home. If you're still alive when I finish making that announcement, I'll be really surprised. Suddenly, the ring met the standards of the commission. He relented. Okay, you can have the show, but next time, I just walked away. And so there's Ole using that, okay, we'll just go cancel the show and nobody gets paid deal. And all of a sudden, magically, everything, he's puts it right out there. It's like, it calls the bluff, basically.
Oh, yeah. And, when he did it, I don't know, maybe the Grand Rapids time was after Saginaw, but he knew it would work.
Yeah.
When it happened, when I was there, I was generally seeing it. That was the only time I saw it. I figured he wasn't, I know Ole Anderson wasn't going to give back 17. I think it was a 17 or maybe $27,000 house that night. He wasn't going to give that money back under any circumstances.
Well, that's why I called it a bluff.
yeah, but it looked like he would. He had me convinced. He said, go tell the boys to all take their boots off.
He was a convincing man, Bob.
Oh, yeah. And very brusque. Yeah, very matter of fact about it. Like, okay, that's what we're going to do. And all of a sudden, the guy who's the commission guy, was waiting for Ole to go in his pocket and bring out some money, or at least offer it. And Ole didn't go anywhere near his pocket. He said, all right, back up. We're canceling the show. The guy said, oh, my God. Any money. I not only said he paid a few bucks, my understanding was all over the country was that it was 10%.
I don't know how all that worked. I thought state to state athletic commission deals were different. I could be wrong. Yeah, I know they were getting paid something out of there. And some states even called for the wrestling promotions to use their state athletic appointed referees, at least for some of the matches, which had to be just awful. You would see that in New York a lot, even in Madison Square Garden, but they would specifically give those guys like the crap matches, that didn't really matter. It's like, okay, well, if you got to work, they're not working Bruno or Backlund or things like that. So, or anything with a convoluted finish that they could screw up.
I seem to remember one of those, at least maybe where they tried it, because you're going to have to pay the guy, or they said, well,
that's the deal. Pay our guy. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, they say we're paying him $300. Of course they weren't, but they would ask Ole to give them the $300 to pay the guy. Of course, they're probably going to give him $10. He was, Ole was way ahead of him on all that stuff. Ole didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he didn't do drugs. And so, and he was an intelligent guy, and he was a healthy guy. He didn't overeat, he slept, he worked, he did, he was all business.
Yeah.
So they were messing with the wrong guy there. I mean, again, 99 times out of 100, whoever he's talking to, he's going to be smarter than they are. And I was happy and lucky to be able to work with them for so long. As far as the athletic commissions, I don't know if they're all affiliated in terms of belonging to like one large national athletic commission. I don't believe so.
I think they're state appointed, I believe.
I agree. What I'm saying is that we just want to point out, not an exception, but just a condition. Was that my understanding was if I was unlicensed or delicensed in California, I was delicensed all over in 28 states. But the states that did, at least that's what I was told from California, was shires. I can't go back to the East Coast and work in any states that have a commission. I won't have a license. I won't be able to work.
Right.
Although, we didn't have to apply to get licenses from them. I'm curious how that would work. They would have to be on the lookout for you, I guess.
Yeah. That's kind of interesting, especially with no internet and all that computer knowledge back then. So it would have been interesting how that would have worked back then.
My understanding of why the main motivation, and this is good. I'm so glad I'm talking to you about this. I'm curious. My understanding was the reason that Vince Jr. exposed the business as a sports entertainment was by doing that, he didn't have to, it was no longer an athletic contest.
Correct.
He didn't have to pay the commission anymore.
Yeah, he avoided dealing with their rules as well.
Well, think about that Detroit, the Silverdome. What was that? It was 93,000 tickets sold, right?
Sure.
Well, that was a multi-million-dollar house. He's got to give 10% out of the way to commission. Can you imagine having to write out a check for $300 or $400 to some people that aren't doing a damn thing for you? Yeah, oh my God! I don't blame him if that was McMahon's reason for doing it. I don't blame him. It was a smart move.
No, yeah, and obviously the state commissions, they were smart enough to know this wasn't on the level, and they were just taking advantage of the situation anyway. They want to call this real? Well, we'll teach them. Basically, I'm assuming that's how they looked at it. Now, Ole was smart enough to bluff these guys, and it worked in most instances. But he says there were also some cases, like in Atlanta, where there was apparently a shady fire marshal, where Ole said, I just paid the guy. One night, the fire marshal said, you have too many people in this building. I looked around and I said, what are you talking about? There's empty seats all over the building. And there was. He wasn't going to take no for an answer. He said, I'm telling you, you have too many people here. I directed his attention to a section of bleachers. Look over there. You have a whole section of empty seats. Once again, he simply said, you've got too many people. I handed him $100 and he said, okay. So that's an instance of somebody taking advantage of the situation.
Of course.
Fire marshal. And, we're going to have that in any walk of life, I suppose. And that was just an instance where Ole realized, this guy's not going to take no for an answer. And he throws him $100 and the guy's on his way, which is unfortunate, but that's the kind of thing you had to deal with. And I told that story because it kind of sets the stage for things to come here in the Jim Barnett story.
When we talked about Roy Shire, we're talking still about athletic commissions. Mm-hmm. We talked about Shire stealing the money from the towns. They had commission in California too, and him taking money, especially out of the Cow Palace in cash in his briefcase.
Yes,
there had to be a commissioner in the box office to check the gate and verify the gate because they were getting 10% of it. So what happened was that Shire. And this is what we heard at the time. He had a guy on the tape. I happened to be coming back, a few years later, I happened to be coming back from, Australia or someplace. I was reading an old Sports Illustrated on a plane. And in the first couple of pages of the Sports Illustrated, they had these little pictures, little boxes. They had like 5 or 6 in a row on the page, and they have a little blurb about something about them. And one of the pictures, the second one down on that one, was a picture of this guy, and I was reading it. It was a guy who had been the commissioner in San Francisco in California, who had been found guilty of stealing money, and from the box office from the Cow Palace, and he had just been given 5 years in jail. And that was at least one of the guys that Shire was signing off on Shires. He'd do just like Ole did. He slipped the guy $100 or I don't know, 500, whatever. If that allowed him to steal 20,000, he didn't care.
Right.
He'd give him as little as he could get away with giving him. He wasn't going to spend a nickel.
Spend a little money to make a lot, right? So throw away 500 to make 20 grand. What the hell? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I totally get it.
But you think about it, man. When you know that there's a box office, if you know that Columbus or Cleveland, whoever. Last time they drew $50,000, you know that. Well, now it's 8:00 on the evening of the next show, and the Masters are getting ready to start, and most of the people are there. There's close to $50,000 on the premises.
Right.
What we talked to a few minutes ago, you mentioned, well, the reason the guys were there were for the money, right? That green stuff is laying a bunch of it's laying around. It just happens to be in somebody else's position, or possession. So how can we figure out some way to get our hands on some of it? And the Athletic Commission is a great gimmick.
Boy, that's the Athletic Commission, and some of these promoters, as you mentioned, Roy Shire, in this case, Jim Barnett. That was actually an excellent segue into the next story we're going to tell here. Chapter 31 in Ole's book is titled Power Play, and it's all about missing money. And we'll begin there, and we'll see how far we get into this part of the story, Bob, and we'll continue it on the next episode of the program.
Sounds good, Ray. Sounds good.
So Ole says it wasn't uncommon for promoters to take money out of the box office every night to cover incidental expenses or to pay off politicians and the sports commissioners, to grease the wheels, so to speak. At least that was the reason they gave us for dipping into the till. When the towns were doing good business, the amount of money being taken ran into the thousands. We were running up to 20 towns in Georgia alone, all of which were a potential source of unreported income. As an example, a good house in Rome, Georgia was $3,000, but over a period of a year, the town would probably average around $2,000 a week. In a small town of that size, a promoter could knock down $300 to $500 a week off the top. Skim from the top is what Ole's saying here. So
right.
when we were running Columbus, Ohio, where the gate was often $50,000 every 3 weeks, Jim Barnett had me and or Ronnie West and or Bobby Simmons and or Charlie Smith bring $3,000 or more of that $50,000 in cash back to him in Atlanta in the office. In some small towns, Barnett would tell Charlie Smith, "Hey, Charlie, we have to pay some politicians off, so we need $500 out of the house." If the house was $2,200, the report would come back $1,700, while Charlie delivered the other $500 to the office and Jim Barnett. Ronnie West would bring money from Statesboro. "Oh, Ronnie, when you run Statesboro tonight, I need $500, Jim Barnett said. Doug Smith was working for Barnett in Marietta. Charlie Harbin was handling Rome and Augusta, Georgia. The amount of cold, hard cash being delivered to the offices of Atlanta was huge. And the funny thing about it was almost everybody was taking money to Barnett without even realizing that everybody was taking money to Barnett because nobody was talking to anybody else." So
right.
We can stop there for a minute and just get your take on that alone.
Well, it's interesting, the part about not telling anybody. Barnett probably told him that. I don't know if Barnett tipped anybody, like he gave him the 20 or whatever to do that. But, he probably told him, like, I don't know what he would say. I never did that with him, of course, that kind of transaction.
Right.
I'm sure he didn't want the guys talking, so he would probably do something. I mean, Barnett was very sharp. He was very, very smart person.
You don't get those kind of connections and have that kind of success in the world unless you have some sort of intelligence behind you. So, yeah, he didn't get there by accident.
When Richard Nixon got inaugurated the second time, Barnett was standing on the reviewing stand in front of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I saw that picture. I thought, was it doctored? And it wasn't. He was a big deal. But how could he possibly be there? But he had some ends. He had some connections in the government. And if you think about his personal sexual identity, that would give you inroads. If, people with like gender preference or, who are also homosexual, you have a circuit. You have people you can connect with on that basis alone. I don't want to typecast or anything. You have people of all natures, genders, races, religions, creeds, codes, whatever. Again, they had something at the time. It was looked down upon. You had to hide. You had to be in the closet, and you, of course, would create kind of a closeness in a sense. So there would be all kinds of people that Barnett could reach out to. He and Ric Flair were the two people that always dressed to the nines. They looked like $1 million outside the ring. I never saw Barnett in a pair of sweatpants and a shirt. Every time I saw
it's so funny thinking of Jim Barnett dressed up. We just did a video cast yesterday. We went back to 1975 in All Japan, and Barnett was over there front row watching the show, and Abdullah and Dory Funk spilled to the floor and it had to be a rib, began fighting right over top of him. And he gets up, oh my boy, he gets up and runs the hell out of, gets the hell out of Dodge. He wanted no part of the blood, no part of that.
Oh, yeah.
It was hilarious.
Yeah.
So.
Abby wanted to bleed all over him, I'm sure. Oh, yeah. I could just see Barnett taking off. Yeah, and he was, you know, you got to give guy credit in a way because he was obviously, he was a queen, what's called a queen. He was he was feminine in his nature and the way he acted, but he looked like $1 million, and he wasn't. Oh, I think a guy weighed about 130 pounds. He wasn't very big,
right?
But he had that $500,000 or whatever $1,000 suit on, and jewelry, a Rolex watch or something, a crystal or something, to where he looked like I say, he looked like a wealthy man. In Australia, he took me around and introduced me to all the top executives at 3 different television stations. The president or the owner of the television station, not the manager, but the owners of the stations. So I mean, obviously he had a way of getting to the very inner core,
right,
of where the authority and the power is.
I think that's why a lot of the guys didn't question bringing money back to him, because he's saying, I got to pay off these politicians and so, because Barnett really knew the politicians. He knew the inside people in a lot of these areas, which was just crazy to think how to go back in time and try to figure out how the hell he cultivated this big group of inside connections. But it's kind of funny going back, just to the story too, real quick. If you think about it, even on the low end, even if you round down, if he was taking $300 out of all the small towns and even just $500 out of all the big towns, that's well over $3,000 a week that he's pocketing,
right?
Allegedly pocketing, according to Ole. And that's why there's a little more to the story here. As Ole says, I questioned Charlie Harbin about the Augusta money and a few other deals that were taking place. Charlie was an old timer who was loyal to Barnett for one reason. Barnett paid him. He didn't care for Barnett, but he knew where his money was coming from. Augusta, which was usually a sellout, ran anywhere from 10 to 12,000 on a weekly basis. If you multiply the houses times 50, that's a cool 500,000 plus for the year. But for some reason, that money didn't go directly to Atlanta. Charlie used to bring the money back from Augusta until one day when he suddenly began depositing it into a bank account right there in Augusta, an account set up specifically for that money only. And I asked Charlie, why are you depositing the money in Augusta? That money should go directly to the Atlanta office. Charlie replied, well, that's just to avoid getting hit over the head and robbed. I called Barnett and asked him about the situation. Why doesn't Charlie just get the cashier's check and bring it back? Oh, Ole, you don't understand how that works. You have to bank there because one of the board members of the bank is Carl Sanders, the former governor of Georgia. If we didn't use his bank for the Augusta proceeds, he'd be all upset. The account was used to pay the wrestlers, but it was also used to pay somebody else, says Ole. In other words, not all the money was getting to the stockholders of Georgia Championship Wrestling.
Wow. I feel like such a chump because it just came to me when you talked about, and what you just said just verified it. Mm-hmm. You know why Barnett was standing up on the reviewing stand at Nixon's inauguration? Was because the money he was taking, he was making political donations.
You think?
Yes, he was. Of course he was. Okay. That's what how would he get up there?
So he bought his way on the stage. I get it. Okay, now that makes sense. You're right. Yeah, I never thought of it that way. Okay, that makes sense. I was always wondering what he was doing standing up there, but now it makes sense.
I was always wondering what he did with all the money he was stealing. What are you doing with all that money? What he was doing was buying his way into, like those TV executives in Australia. He didn't have to buy his way into theirs, but maybe what he did, maybe he sent him a $5,000 or $500 bottle of scotch. Or I know he had me take around booze and stuff to a bunch of newspapers. So yeah, of course he was doing that. He wouldn't send us $18 bottle of scotch to them. He sent something that cost several $100 that was like really special. That opened doors for him. And once he got in there,
sure,
he had the intelligence and the connections that he could take advantage of it. So yeah,
we can't prove any of that, but that certainly sounds like a good hypothesis as to how Jim Barnett found himself in some of the positions that it appear. Looks can be deceiving, but at the same time, perception is reality. And so with Jim Barnett standing on the stage with the president-elect, obviously that's a big deal, right? So
yeah.
So Ole goes on here real quickly. This is we're going to wrap up this part of the story. He says, "What I do know is that a percentage of the money from Augusta from many of the shows was being delivered directly to Jim Barnett. I made many of these deliveries myself. That's how I know. But the proceeds from Augusta, cha-ching," says Ole. Basically saying Jim Barnett was pocketing almost all of the Augusta money. I don't know why he chose Augusta, but apparently it was working out well. Ole agrees that there may have been some politicians to pay off. He's not doubting that, but not on a scale in the respect to the amount of money that was being collected. For the most part, the commissioners were only interested in measuring the height of the ring, making sure that you had the proper wrestling attire, and making certain that their cockamamie doctor had given you some kind of a physical. So basically, the money doesn't add up is what Ole's saying. Maybe we had to give this guy a couple $100, but Barnett took $5. So what happened to the rest of that? And so I see where he's going with this. And that basically sets the stage for the next part of the story we're going to get into, which is Ole basically calling Barnett out and having some conversations with him in regards to where's this money going, Jim?
Yeah. I'm sure Barnett had all kinds of explanations, but it wouldn't matter. Even if, say Barnett came completely clean.
Yeah.
Of course, that's hypothetical. He would be too smart to do that. But if he did, he said, well, I'm tell you what, Ole, I am giving it to, but to see the people that he was giving money to, it wasn't all about wrestling. It was about other aspects of his life, too. To have the clout that he had with the federal government, for example. He could certainly protect his wrestling investment. Think about this. How many times did people go before the Congress, National Congress, on the antitrust stuff about pro wrestling? Mm-hmm. Then several times, right?
Sure.
And they always got just sent home, right?
Essentially, yeah. That's pretty much how it would end.
Well, geez, I wonder if Barnett knew any of those guys that were sitting on the panel that was hearing that case brought against the promotion, his promotion. I wonder if he paid any of those guys up there. I imagine he paid all of them if he could.
I think that works in any world of politics and business and law, though. I mean, I hate to say it, but I mean, if the price is right, we've seen some things disappear, right?
I doubt very seriously if Roy Shire to give him a nickel.
Well, that's Roy Shire. He's more of the
I don't know
the exception, not the rule.
I'm trying to visualize Fritz doing it or Vern. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know, but I know Barnett. He was certainly protecting himself. In a day when gays were in the closet, you couldn't. Now there's complete acceptance. Well, maybe not acceptance, but at least awareness. People are making their personal qualities, or nobody's hiding it anymore, which is great. I think people should be able to be what they are, whatever they are. Most of the time, they're born that way. So Jim Barnett, being little and effeminate and small, physically again, he bought protection for himself. That's what I think he was spending a lot of his money on, was looking at every way he could. I don't mean personal bodyguards. He didn't have like a Cato or, I can imagine like the James Bond movie, The Odd Job.
Odd Job,
he
right.
I always looked at Charlie Tanaka as would be a great bodyguard for somebody. He looked like he could kill a moose. But Barnett looked for ways to have influence, let's put it that way, and be able to call in favors. Who knows what kind of parties he might have had, where he would be the host and all kinds of things would be going on. Party might cost him $25,000 to run, but he would have movers and shakers there, and by doing that, he would gain influence and recognition, and he'd become a lot more powerful. You know what? I've actually gotten more respect for Barnett through this last couple hours than I had when we started, because I see what he was doing. I think that I don't know for sure, but logically, I mean, we never saw where Barnett was spending his money. And he took a lot of money out of the wrestling business over the years.
Right.
So, but the way he was connected, you don't get up on the reviewing stand with the president being sworn on your looks or whatever. You have to purchase your way up there, and that's certainly what he did.
Certainly, yeah. Big contributor, obviously. It's a shame though. By the time he passed away, I'm not saying he was destitute, but he certainly wasn't the big millionaire that he was, back in the heyday, his prime years, if you will. And Ole's going to get into that a lot. We probably won't get to that here on this episode, but just a little bit more here before we close up this week, Bob, in regards to skimming some money disappearing, and business in a whole. Ole talks a little bit about some financial woes throughout a part of 1982. He says Georgia was in trouble at a time. Money was continually being siphoned out of the houses for incidental expenses. If we did 51,000 in Columbus, only 46,000 showed up in the books. If we did 22 in Atlanta, only 19,000 would show up in the books. Nobody wanted to ask Barnett for an accounting of the money because Barnett was the power. He had been around the business since 1948, and he had a lot of connections. We just talked about that. Everyone was under the impression that Barnett was a multimillionaire. The truth is, by the 1980s at least, Barnett wasn't a multimillionaire. He wasn't even a $1 millionaire. Eddie Graham told me that he loaned $100,000 to Barnett to help him finance Australia at one point, and they were having a tough time making any money. So you talked about when you were sent over there, and there was questions in regards to Eddie Graham kind of checking in how things were going over there. And it makes me wonder if it's because, again, we go back to Eddie Graham had some investment multiple times, it would seem, in trying to help people run the Australian territory. But we come back here, the promotion obviously shuts down. Barnett packs his bags, comes back to the United States, sells it to the Fuller family. At that point, Eddie Graham asked Barnett, "Whatever happened to my $100,000? Do you have anything left of it?" Eddie laughed and said, "Wouldn't you know it, Barnett told me that he spent every penny." So he never paid Eddie Graham back the $100,000. Fred Ward, Fred Ward was one of the promoters in Georgia. For those who don't know, he ran Columbus, I know for sure, and a couple other towns, I believe.
Macon.
Okay, Macon. That makes sense. Yeah, Macon and Columbus. Fred Ward told me that Jim Barnett would ask the partners for money on occasion. This is the story as Fred told it to me, says Ole. Barnett would let things run their course for a year or so, and then he would tell his partners, Fred Ward and Paul Jones, "Oh my goodness, we're in financial trouble. We all need to ante up $50,000 apiece." Barnett was referring to Ward, Jones, and himself. All of them $50,000. Fred would kick in his 50. Paul Jones would add his 50. Barnett would say that he kicked in his 50. But according to Fred Ward, he and Paul Jones always wondered if Barnett actually kicked anything in. So basically, Barnett implying we need $150,000, but he probably only really needed $100,000, maybe less than that. And he got the other guys to pay for all of it, is what Ole's saying here. And he goes on and says, regardless, Barnett now had $100,000 of capital to play with. 2 months later, as the company made a few bucks, Georgia would repay $50,000 to Fred Ward, $50,000 to Paul Jones, and presumably $50,000 to Jim Barnett. So they're getting their money back, and Jim Barnett's getting $50,000 for free.
Yes,
isn't that now? You can look at that any which way you want. That's obviously some shady business practice, but at the same time, I mean, that's a hell of a con job. Hell of a con job.
Pretty smart. Yeah. Well, we talked about another program. We talked about money in paper bags. I'm curious. I know that Fred Ward and they didn't give him $50,000. They didn't give him $50,000 in cash in a paper bag. But I'm curious, how were that kind of money is supposed to be taxable. How were the taxes handling all this money passing hands? I mean, it sounds to me like there was a lot of criminality going on there. With I can't imagine everybody.
Come on.
Yeah, of course. What am I thinking? Of course, there wouldn't be anything untoward in any wrestling promotions. Oh my God, I can't see Fred and Paul Jones. I wonder if they would put that on their taxes or not. There's a deduction.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but basically it was Jim Barnett basically playing stocks with other people's money and then hitting.
Oh, yeah.
And they get their money back, so they don't really ask a lot of questions, although they suspect that Jim's the one handling all of the money. They don't ever actually see any of this going on. And so I can say, hey, I need $6,000 to go buy this over here, and I'll give you your money back later. Really, I only needed $4,000, right? So I could potentially take $2,000, keep it for myself, and pay you back the $4,000, and then whatever the deal might be, and then I don't have it all, but they would be happy in that instance as well. But in this instance, they're not even going to question anything, even if they are questioning it in their minds, because they're getting all of their money back.
Well, the rest of the stockholders paid Paul Jones and back the $100,000, and Barnett got their $100,000 to spend, and then he got another $50,000.
Yeah, for himself.
He got paid back the money he never put up.
Yeah.
But hey, we'll say you got to hand it to the guy. The guy that's getting the money first is the guy that's in the driver's seat the whole way. In fact, he's not in the driver's seat. He's an engineer on the locomotive, and there's nobody else in there with him.
Right.
So yeah, he's running the whole train. So, yeah, having that position, that's what Ole had to get if he was going to have be able to actually have the power. The power was that money, the money that was coming in.
Yeah.
You're talking about just 2 weeks alone when things were going good was $400,000. Coming some serious money.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, I don't know what Georgia was doing, but you have to figure the other 2 weeks, they had to do at least, they do more than 50. Let's say they only did 50. You're looking at $500,000 a month. That's $6 million a year of business. $6 million a year. And I don't know how much would be expenses. I don't think, of course, certainly a lot of it would, but maybe not even as much as half would be, because the wrestlers we're supposed to get 30-some%, 31 or 33 or whatever. I'm not sure anybody, if they ever did. And the other thing, get 33% of what? The 17 that they brought back instead of the 22 that it really was from the little town you were talking about.
Right, absolutely.
And getting paid on the $45,000 in Cleveland instead of the 50, or in Columbus instead of the 50,000 at Drew. That's why the guys were always complaining about payoffs.
Sure.
Because the guys that worked in these buildings, over and over and over again, they knew what the game was. They could tell if the building was sold out at a certain ticket price. They knew even if you didn't, if nobody told you, you could figure it out. And so when they got paid off, they weren't getting paid 30. They might have been getting paid 30-some%, the correct percent, but it was on that lower figure after the money had been taken off the top. So yeah, they were getting screwed the whole time.
What do you make of Ole basically saying that Barnett may have been a millionaire at some point, but for most of his run here, at least since coming back from Australia, he really didn't have the money that he presented himself as having. He would basically rob from Peter to give to Paul, so to speak. It looks like he's skimming from the top of all of the towns in Georgia, according to Ole. He's finding ways to con his partners into giving him money. He's paying them back, but he's also making a lot extra for himself there. He talks about borrowing $100,000 from Eddie Graham and not even having to repay it. So it seems like his clout and his stature enables him to kind of walk around and make money for doing absolutely nothing other than being a really clever con man.
Yes, he was good. He was really good at it. He looked the part. Like I said, he was always immaculate. He had money. Everything about him spoke money. Even his glasses looked like they cost a couple of grand. He had a $500 haircut, probably. Yeah. So yeah, he looked the part. His shoes were always shined. His clothes always fit immaculately. He looked the part. He looked great. The fact that he was so effeminate. He got Dick the Bruiser on one side and Abdullah on the other. And, here he is standing in the middle of them. And if you walked in, you look at the three of them, especially if Bruiser and Abdullah have both just come back from a match where they're bleeding, and Barnett's standing there between them, you would assume, well, who's that little guy? What is he, their little manager or something? Who is he? Well, no, that's the boss. That little bitty guy. Mm-hmm. Those two big monsters over there, they do exactly what he asked them to do or tells them to do. He was good, I tell you. He had a life that he always had plenty of money to throw around and, buy whatever kind of life he wanted to have. He did it probably from the very beginning. So
yeah, I mean, he got his start, I believe, for Fred Kohler, which predates the Dumont Network, but he worked for Kohler at the Dumont Network, I think, for Chicago wrestling. He goes and starts running his own outfit in Indianapolis or Indiana, somewhere thereabouts. And
Indianapolis.
Yeah. And and it goes on from there. It just gets bigger and bigger. He goes off to Australia, has to this day one of the most successful wrestling territories financially that ever existed. And then, he comes back here. They need help in the Georgia war with Ann Gunkel. He comes back, runs Ann out of business, and gets his, hand in a whole lot of different drawers at that point and pulls money out of him, apparently, is what he's doing. But yeah, and he goes on and he even somehow works himself into a job with Vince in the mid-'80s there. I don't think he did anything other than he sold his stock to Vince, and so he got to keep his name around, and he probably got paid a little bit for a few years there till they realized, we don't need you, pal. And then, Vince cuts him loose, and he didn't really do a whole lot after that.
Yeah. You asked a minute ago about what I thought about his money. I'm getting old information tied together with new stuff from our conversation this last hour and a half.
Yeah.
I think that Barnett, he spent a lot of money on buying his position. I think he was the kind of guy that he wasn't giving $5,000 donation. If he was doing it like twice a month. Otherwise, he was given $25,000, and maybe he did it every year, and maybe he was bribing 4 or 5, or supporting.
Right
now, they do it legally. They have these political action committees that, where they can just bribe guys right up.
Donate, yeah, absolutely, man.
Yeah,
for the cause.
But that was illegal back in Barnett's day. But there was always ways to do it. I mean, you could do it, just slip it under the table. Here was, yes, of course. Think about it. His money was never reported, right?
Sure.
All the money that they were bringing back, the $4,000 from all those different guys were bringing back to the office, if they were all bringing them, every week, if they was getting $20,000, that's $80,000 or $90,000 a month. For him to take 40 of it and give to a politician, he didn't have to report it. He didn't, and the politician didn't have to report it because the money wasn't traceable. I doubt very seriously Barnett didn't list it as income. He took that money and he gave it. He bought things with it.
Oh, no, absolutely. This is under the table money. It wasn't even claimed.
Yeah, all under the table. And he just took it and he handed it out to people who could do things for him. He bought himself into a position where he was under secretary or something for art in the government for somebody, where he actually had a role in the government. I doubt the pay was very much, but yeah, he had all that. He could take cash.
It looks nice to put that on your wall, though.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Yeah. Well, I tell you.
Credential. I work underneath the president for the government in the art department. Oh, wow. You are somebody special, apparently. So
when he brought that picture back from the inauguration with him, he brought the picture back. I thought it was a joke. I thought he had it as a phony, Mm-hmm. And then I found out from somebody. I looked it up, and it was genuine. So in order to get up there, you have to been. What else could he have been doing for him? He had to be giving people a lot of money. Had to be going out. He was bribing the right people. Let's put it that way. But he was always working at the very highest echelon. He was talking to movers and shakers most of the time. He wasn't go to the bar and have a beer type of guy. Yeah, very interesting. I think there's a lot more to Jim Barnett that meets the eye. I'd like to find out.
And there's a lot more we're going to get into on the next episode, guys, as we wrap this episode up. Next time, we're going to talk about Ole confronting Jim Barnett, asking him where all of this money's going, and how Ole forces Jim Barnett out of the office. So Barnett obviously owns a stake in Georgia Championship Wrestling, but moving forward, he will no longer be able to, he wasn't booking or anything like that to begin with, but now he also will not be able to put his hands on the actual money. We're going to see what happens from that point forward. And of course, that's going to lead to Barnett and crew selling their stocks to Vince McMahon and the WWF here and within the next couple of years in Georgia. So lots of great stuff to get into next time. And then I think once we get through with the Barnett stuff, we can kind of go back and start actually talking about wrestling again, Bob. But I'm looking forward to it.
Wrestling. Oh, yeah. Well, that's right. We've been in paper bags and money bags and cash bags, haven't we? I thought, you know what? We've talked a lot about what goes on behind the scenes, and what was going on with Barnett behind the scenes was a lot more interesting than what was going on with someone like Nick Goulas behind the scenes. He was a mover. He was a mover and a shaker. No doubt about it. And, a very interesting guy. Another thing, think about it. For a guy so flamboyant and visible to have so much secrecy about his personal life, very few people know anything about his personal life. Personal life, again, I knew Jim Barnett starting back in 68, 69, when I first went to Australia. And I knew him the rest of my career. And at one time, he and I were, I don't want to say close, but he liked me. He liked my girlfriend. And, it wasn't until I got my own idea about what I wanted to do in the business. And I wouldn't stretch people for him. Then he didn't have much use for me. But but he managed to keep his private life just that, very private, for a guy that was so out there.
Well, when you're allegedly siphoning this kind of money, you need to keep everything on the quiet, I guess.
Oh, well, that's true. That's true too.
Well, we're going to get into all of that next time, Bob. I'm looking forward to seeing what Ole does here with Jim Barnett moving forward and how it all comes together. I skimmed the section. I haven't read it in weeks, so I don't remember exactly how it goes down, but it's going to be fun to break it out and talk it over with you, and I'm sure you can go back and kind of reimagine it yourself. So it's going to be fun for next time around. But right now, guys, we're going to wrap things up. So, Bob, I appreciate you doing this once again.
Well, thank you, Ray. I appreciate the education because I took some old information, added a bunch of stuff to it, and have some new ideas. That I always like that. If I'm getting new information and new ideas, that means I didn't have the full picture. So I got a better picture, and I'm looking forward to getting some more next time. But thank you again, and thank you, our friends and folks out there listening to us. Everybody, please stay well, and we'll look forward to being back with you soon.